Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us today for our latest installment of the AVERT webinar. As you can probably see from our background, we're doing a hybrid event for today because we're really pleased to host in person in Australia Dr. Aaron Zelin. We're very grateful to him to make the time to engage with our network and deliver our AVERT webinar for this month. He's got a packed schedule, and so thank you again for being with us here, Dr. Zelin. So before we begin, just as customary, I'd like to offer an acknowledgement of country. I want to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people. Want to acknowledge and thank them for their custodianship of the land for many centuries and acknowledge their elders past and present. So we'll get right started this morning. Today, Dr. Aaron Zelin is going to be talking to us about the evolution of the Islamic State. So 10 years since the Caliphate's announcement. I want to leave as much time as we can for his presentation and also for questions. So I'll just very quickly introduce Dr. Zelin and also just give some housekeeping in terms of the Q&A portion of the session. So Dr. Aaron Zelin is the Levi Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he directs and founded the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Map project, which is a terrific resource. I've used it myself, and I'd recommend you to also take a look. He's also a visiting research scholar in the Department of Politics at Brandeis University, an affiliate with the Global Peace and Security Center at Monash University, and founder of the widely acclaimed website Jihadology. He is author of the book, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad, published by Columbia University Press, which was nominated for the Neve Memorial Book Prize in 2020. He also has a second book, The Age of Political Jihadism, the Study of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was published recently in 2023. He's also working on another book, very productive, titled Heartland of the Believers, A History of Syrian Jihadism. Dr. Zelin's research focuses on Sunni jihadist groups in the Levant, North Africa, Afghanistan, and the Sahel, as well as trends of jihadi governance, online mobilization, and foreign fighting. And he's conducted field research throughout the region in Tunisia, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel, and also has testified and served as an expert witness in front of Congress and other judicial cases. So before I hand it over to Dr. Zelin, who will be delivering his presentation, once this presentation is finished, please feel free to, for those of you online, to put your questions in the Q&A function. We'll be moderating that Q&A. They'll be coming into us, and we'll try to get through them as best we can. And obviously, those who are joining us in the room, just give a signal, and we'll take your questions later. So with that, off to Dr. Zelin. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thank you so much for having me, Lydia. It's pleasure to be here. I haven't been in Australia actually since 10 years ago, so it's kind of fortuitous that, I'm talking about 10 years since the Islamic State, because actually one of the reasons I came here is everybody was so worried about what was going on at this time about 10 years ago. Though I was here actually when it was the summer here last time. So it's a little bit different now, but it's okay. I actually don't mind this weather. I'm from Chicago. So it's good to be back, and thanks for everybody online and thanks for everybody in person. So one of the things that I was curious about actually while I was putting this PowerPoint together was like, I wonder what I actually had in a PowerPoint when I was talking about this 10 years ago. So I actually looked back on my Google Drive and something that was dated in July 2024, so 10 years ago. And this is what I came up with. Obviously, it's just screenshots of different slides. But I thought it was interesting to look back at sort of where we were then and where we are now in terms of the knowledge base and what people were interested in learning. And as you could see, a lot of this is kind of very basic stuff if you look at it now. If those that follow the Islamic State or those that follow what was going on in Syria and Iraq at the time, it seems as if this information is like common wisdom. But back then in, July 2014, this was kind of like new information for a lot of people. So I think it's important when we're, talking about these issues, sort of looking back and thinking of how much we actually know now compared to in the past and where we are in terms of dealing with the issue. Because although, we know a lot about the Islamic State, of course, there's been a lot that has happened in the last 10 years in relation to this. And then I also was curious, in the aftermath of the Islamic State's territory, being lost in Iraq and Syria in 2017 to 2019. I was curious what I was talking about, like a year later in 2020, which is 4 years ago now. just because at the time, a lot of people were like, ISIS, what's the deal in the future? Like maybe not as big of a problem. And it's interesting because the number of attacks, as you'll see coming up in Iraq and Syria, for example, this I think was in March or April 2020 that these slides were from originally. The amount of attacks in April in this case for 2020 or whatever is about the same amount of attacks that the Islamic State has had all year so far this year. So you can see that comparatively speaking, the number of claims of attacks has gone down a lot. And we're already talking about the whole issue, a year after the fall of IS territorial control. Obviously, some has changed, but still not too much. And then, there were debates about whether ISIS was going to be able to take advantage in places like Somalia or even in the Indian subcontinent or in Afghanistan, especially in light of, it was being around the time of when the Taliban was about to take over Afghanistan. And then we also were looking at sort of what's going on with this infighting between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda's branch in the Sahel region, in particular in Mali. Whereas nowadays, they do fight each other here and there, but they kind of have separated and are dealing with different parts of the territorial control or insurgency in different parts of Mali or the Sahel generally, in a similar fashion to what we saw in what happened in Syria, where originally, Al-Qaeda in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra at the time, was fighting the Islamic State, but eventually, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, more or less took over parts of northwest Syria, whereas the Islamic State decided to take over more the north central as well as the northeastern and eastern parts of Syria and kind of live and let live, even though they didn't like each other. So it's kind of interesting now that we're, a number of years from a bunch of things, looking back and seeing where we are now, especially considering that at least today, many people doing research on this, many analysts, many people in government are very much sort of worried about the state of the Islamic State and increasing violence, as well as the potential for them to take advantage of all the various things happening worldwide right now. So just to give a little context of the state of things in relation to the Islamic State's attacks since 2018 or so, when they have been losing territory in Syria and Iraq at the time, you can see that the bar has gone down. Of course, the vast majority of it has gone down from Iraq and Syria. If you look at the red, which is just outside of Iraq and Syria, primarily Africa, I should say, it's stayed relatively steady. And the thing to remember and note about 2024 is that data is only through May. So it's only the first 5 months of this year, not even up to almost the end of June. So you can see that if you extrapolate that out to the end of this year, it's definitely going to surpass last year. And it probably will get relatively, up there closer maybe to what happened in 2022. But of course, it's also contextualizing with the fact that the Iraq and Syria data is much less. Whereas if you look at the African data, it's on pace to be about the same, if not more than what we saw in 2022, meaning that IS's capabilities within Africa, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, Horn of Africa, is stronger now in some ways than it was a couple of years ago when it was at its peak. Part of this has to do with the fact that in the last 12 to 16, 18 months, the Islamic State's taken over territory in a number of countries, which I'll get to later in the presentation. One of the things to also caveat about some of this data, because this is based off of official claims that the Islamic State is letting everybody know about. Of course, it's important to remember that this is propaganda. And if you actually look at some of their internal documents that have come out in the last few years, at least in the case of Syria, there was a policy of them underreporting their attacks within Syria itself. So even though it shows the numbers going down, if you actually triangulate some of the data in Syria that IS is putting out related to its own attacks versus sort of how the Syrian Democratic Forces, the group that's fighting the Islamic State in Eastern Syria, that's allied with the US and the coalition, it's a bunch more. And then if you compare that then also to local data and regional reporting related to the Assad regime in Russia and Iran and how they're dealing with the Islamic State there and fighting in sort of the desert region in Homs province, it's more there as well. So The strength of the Islamic State in Syria is more than they're trying to put out there. I think part of it is they're trying to lull people to think that they're not as strong as they actually are because they want the US to, of course, withdraw. So if they make it seem as if they're weaker, then they'd be able to take advantage a lot more easily. I should note, though, that in the case of Iraq, they actually truly are very weak in there. They barely do much of anything in Iraq right now, which is quite interesting, which in some ways illustrates some of the successes of what's gone on with the coalition and the partnership with everybody in Iraq. But one of the worries I have, at least when we're looking at this, is that because of the successes in Iraq, this could lead to a slow roll into the reemergence of IS in Iraq, because now there's sort of these debates going on about whether the security relationship should change with Iraq between the US, where it's primarily through the global coalition against Daesh, to one that's more related to a bilateral security relationship, which then has legal consequences because the coalition has sort of a legal framing that allows the US to have a presence in eastern Syria to fight IS there to sort of protect Iraqi territory. But if it changes from that construct to one where it's just bilateral, then that could undermine the legal rationale for the US to be allowed to operate in eastern Syria to fight against the Islamic State. So as I've said to numerous people in the US government when I've talked to this, including people in relation to the coalition, that if there is this change in the status of how this relationship is with Iraq, it is worthwhile putting in some legal proviso related to maintaining a presence in eastern Syria so that the US can continue to protect Iraq from the potential of the Islamic State in Syria building itself back up, because as I said, it's actually qualitatively stronger in Syria. And the thing too is, unlike Iraq, which, while it has its own differences within its state, is still the Iraqi state, whereas in Syria you have all these different pieces of different actors controlling different parts of it that are not aligned. And so if the US were to leave Syria in a hypothetical scenario, I think most rational people would think then that Turkey would have a larger open field to go against the SDF, because they view them as essentially a branch of the PKK. And there is some level of truth to that. And Turkey, views them as more of a security threat for them, because the PKK has been involved in terrorism within Turkey. So as a consequence, it's unlikely that the SDF would be much interested in continuing to fight against ISIS, especially within the Deir ez-Zor region, which is not Kurdish at all, and more just pack their bags and focus on their heartland in the Hasaka region in the northeast of Syria. And therefore, that would provide ample space for the Islamic State to try and take advantage and potentially take over territory again in different parts of Deir ez-Zor province. And as I'll discuss in a little bit, they've been continuing to do shadow governance over the last 5 years since they lost territory there, even though it isn't put in their propaganda, but based off of local sources from on the ground. So that's sort of a little context in some ways, and better understanding some of these data points, because sometimes data can be helpful in understanding issues, and sometimes it's a bit deceiving. So I think it's important to sort of contextualize this, because it obviously looks like a huge downward turn, where in fact the trajectory in Africa is worse than it's ever been. And then in the case of Syria, for example, they're underreporting what they're actually doing. So just to give a little bit more perspective in this, in terms of zeroing in on Iraq and Syria, as you can see of the stats every year since 2019, when IS lost territory there, it's gone down in both Iraq and Syria. But as you'll note, if you're looking at 2024, the numbers continue to go down in Iraq. And the data in 2024 is as of June 20th, when the Islamic State last posted its Al-Naba newsletter, where they put statistics out on their weekly attacks. But you can see that there's actually been more attacks so far in the last 5.5+ months than there was all of last year in Syria, that they're at least claiming, which further illustrates that they're at least in this case you could say that they're 3 times stronger in terms of what they're trying to put out there. But if you add it up to potentially what it could be by the end of this year, it would be on par, probably somewhere close to 2021. And at that time, a lot of people were still obviously worried about ISIS's insurgency then. And again, these are claimed attacks, not necessarily every single thing that they're actually doing. But I think it's important to highlight this, because even if they're now showing that they're doing more in 2024, it's comparative to what they had done previously, but it's actually even more when you realize that they're underreporting this. So, one of the biggest concerns, as I alluded to at the beginning of this presentation, has been about, the detention centers and the IDP camps in Northeast Syria, where all the foreign fighters, mainly men, are in jails, or the women and children may be in IDP camps. Of course, there are also many Syrians and Iraqis in these locations as well. It's important to note, especially in the IDP camps, that the vast majority of them are Iraqi or Syrian. I think about 55% are from Iraq. Maybe 25 to 30% are from Syria. And the Syrians can't really be repatriated that much anymore, because most of them that remain are from Assad regime areas, and therefore, from a human rights perspective, the US and allies of the coalition don't want to return those that are from those specific areas. So there's less that we can done on that front. And the remainder are, the third country nationals, as people like to call them, where, there's about 6,700 plus foreigners that are in the whole camp, about 2,100 in the El Roj camp. Those are the two most infamous ones. And as you'll see from this data, there was sort of a spike in 2019 of repatriations. Not surprising, considering the fact that that's when IS originally lost its territory in Syria. But then it went down a lot. We've seen it creep back up again as more and more people have been warning that, this is an issue. It needs to be resolved, because we don't have a lot of time to deal with this, especially if the US does leave. Because it's a scenario where if the US does, then ISIS will try and break people out of not only the prisons, but most likely the IDP camps as well, because then they would be able to not only, rebuild our fighting force, but also the state building project, where it's viewed as sort of this intergenerational aspect where the women and children have a role in it as well. So it's not just about fighting and insurgency and things along those lines. But if you look at sort of the data and how much is left of the contingent of third country nationals left at the current rate, based on the amount of people repatriated since 2019, it would still take another 15 years for all these people to be returned home. I don't know about you, but I don't think we have 15 years to sort of dither on this potential issue, considering all the security concerns that people have about the future of Syria, and less so about Iraq, but especially considering the different geopolitics related to Syria and potential for a US withdrawal. So it's something to consider when we're thinking about this issue, that it really is something that needs to be taken care of. Moving on to Afghanistan, obviously, more recently, we've seen the Islamic State's Khurasan Province become sort of the name du jour related to the Islamic State, especially since they've been involved in a number of external operations. But one of the interesting things is that there's sort of a paradox. Historically, when we think about groups being involved in external operations, usually it's in the context of a safe haven. But in the case of ISKP, actually, since the Taliban took power, the number of attacks that they've been able to do locally and their capabilities there has gone down severely. So if you look at the data from 2018 to 2021, which is sort of the couple of years prior to the Taliban retaking territory, you saw that there was a lot in 2018 to 2019. Then it went back down. Part of that is the leader of the group was killed that year, so they were restructuring themselves. Then they got a new leader. He's still the current leader, Shahab Mujahid. But they're able to take advantage of sort of the security vacuums that we saw in the aftermath of the Taliban taking over. But once the Taliban was able to sort of control the levers of government, they felt like they're comfortable in their place in power now, then they started to really hammer the Islamic State's capabilities within Afghanistan itself. And in October 2021, we saw them setting up the General Directorate of Intelligence. And while it deals with a whole host of criminal activities, you could see that it's writ, as I put on the slide, is Khawarij cells, which is a euphemism for ISKP, people that are involved in kidnapping, smugglers, drug dealers, mafia, whatever the hell that is in reference to. But anyways, that's sort of how they framed the creation of this, the GDI, as they call it. And while they didn't really deal with ISKP in the beginning, especially because they kind of, at the time, were still trying to gaslight everybody by saying that there was no more security issues within Afghanistan, and essentially saying ISKP isn't here, this isn't an issue. But then I think they kind of realized they couldn't shy away from the reality that ISKP was continuing to attack, because as you see, the first year that the Taliban was in power, from August 15, 2021 to 2022, the numbers went up to 314 attacks. But then it went severely down that second year once they started cracking down. And we saw them starting to do arrest campaigns in July 2022. And thus far, since July 2022, there have been 41 ISKP network cells, what have you, that the Taliban has arrested through the GDI. And the thing too is one of the ways, obviously it's propaganda, but also another sort of way of kind of looking at the strength of IS is that, because of the fact that the Islamic State had so many leaders that were killed in such a short period of time, every time there was a new leader, they needed to do a new Bayat campaign or Pledge of Allegiance to the new Caliph. And they put out all these pictures, and it came from all the different provinces within the Islamic State. And I was just curious if you could actually track the fact of ISKP being degraded locally by the number of people showing up in these sort of Bayat campaigns. And as you can see from the data there, when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in there, giving the bayat to the new guy, Abu Ibrahim at the time, there's 135 individuals in the pictures. And then the most recent one in August 2023, when they're giving it to the new guy, Abu Hafs, there was only 32 people. And if you actually compare it to other provinces, you could kind of track the ebb and flow of some of those provinces as well, where the number of people showing up in the ones in different African provinces has gone up every single time just because they've gotten stronger and stronger. So there's another sort of proxy for some kind of showing how you could see IS going down. And this year, at least it's on pace for 53 attacks until August 15th, which is the 3-year anniversary of the Taliban taking over. Obviously not that much lower than last year, which was 69 attacks, but, relatively speaking, considering the fact that it's a fairly large country, it has a history of, violence and militancy, is, not that many. It's, of course, like less than one every few days, essentially, which compared to the past is pretty good, comparatively speaking. And the thing too is then, as a consequence, ISKP started mainly focusing on attacks in Kabul as well as diplomatic entities within the country, as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as the Taliban calls itself, was trying to garner more international legitimacy. So, and this is just some of the data on the different types of arrests that they've had related to ISKP locally, whether it's social media recruitment, procurement of fake IDs, birth certificates, publications, arresting somebody after an attack, finding them through an intelligence-led apparatus, financing, safe houses, weapons procurement, membership, etc. Normal type of stuff, nothing too surprising here when you think about it, but just for illustrative purposes. But then, one of the ways I think ISKP has been able to take it, or not take advantage, but sort of shift some of its priorities as a consequence of the fact that it hasn't been able to do quite as well locally, is the fact that they increasingly started, after the Taliban took over, putting out propaganda in multiple languages. We've seen it in things like Pashto and Urdu, and Farsi/Dari, which obviously are more local languages, but also cross the border into Tajikistan with Tajik, as well as Arabic and English. And therefore, you could see them sort of growing from one that was mainly focused on local, insurgency in Afghanistan and Pakistan to a lesser extent, into, more of a regional, global sort of posture. And as a consequence, we started to see, especially in 2022, that it started moving west more and more every year in terms of their potential for external operations. And part of this, I think, has to do with the fact that even though they don't have the safe haven, they've been taking advantage of encrypted applications where, we talk about directed attacks coming from a group, or inspired attacks where people are just looking at the propaganda and doing something on behalf of the group. Well, they're kind of using that middle one where they're guided, where somebody is in contact with ISKP, but they don't necessarily go to Afghanistan to gain training. There have been cases where that's happened, especially the attacks we've seen in Iran, Tajikistan. I think there was one in Kyrgyzstan, maybe. So that's one thing. But as a consequence of it, they're able to take advantage of residual foreign fighter networks from Central Asia that were people from those countries that went to Iraq and Syria last decade, as well as migrant communities that are in places like Iran, Russia, Turkey, as well as in Western Europe, especially in Germany. Because if you look at sort of their external operations plots as well as attacks, most of them have either happened in Iran, Turkey, Russia, as well as in Germany, but we've seen plots elsewhere as well, as the slides show. And, one of the biggest concerns now, of course, is whether they'll be successful in an attack in the West. Thus far, it hasn't happened. But I mean, one of the biggest risk points I think now that people are worried about is, of course, what happens in the next 6 weeks, primarily related to the Olympics. There have been 2 plots broken up by the French in Paris related to the Olympics already, and we're still, at least 3 weeks or so away from the start of the Olympics, I think, if not maybe a month. I'm not quite sure the exact date it starts. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more plots that happen that they break up ahead of time to make sure. And then there's also the French election that's going on top of this. So things are heightened in general in France, now not even specific to ISKP, but as we know with, these types of groups in general, they take advantage of any seam within society or opportunity to do something. If we're thinking about the potential for a successful attack, even though most of their plots in Western Europe have primarily been in Germany, Paris, France definitely worries me the most in the next 6-week time frame, and hopefully nothing happens. Just to get an idea of some of these different ISKP networks outside of the AFPAC region, this is just a plotting of different arrests related to different networks, whether there are people that have done attacks and then were arrested after the fact, or people related to the attacks that helped out with it, foreign fighter recruitment networks, as well as financial networks related to ISKP. So you can see, this isn't nothing. It's not just in one area of the world. It's happening in a lot of places. So they definitely have been able to project power out to a number of locales over the last few years in many respects. So moving to the Islamic State's governance projects, this is another important aspect of the group, of course. One of the reasons why they became so popular in some ways is the fact that they did control territory. They did try and implement, from their perspective, of course, their version of Islamic law, Sharia, what have you. And for a number of years, they tried to export this out to a number of countries with fits and starts. We saw for a year or two in Libya, they were able to do this in like 2014, 15, 16 time period. We saw this in Afghanistan also for a couple of years, but those both kind of petered out. We've seen it up and down in Nigeria over time. But what we've seen in the last 12 plus months to 18 months is that they've really been able to solidify territorial control over different areas. Of course, the amount of territory they control isn't large scale. It's not like it was in Iraq and Syria when it was the size of the UK. Also in more rural areas than places that had more urban environments like Mosul or Raqqa, for example. But I think it is still important to highlight this because while people focus on the reemergence of the Islamic State vis-a-vis terrorism or insurgency, it's important to remember that, one of the key essences of the Islamic State is the fact that they are a state and they're interested in governing. So they keep on doing this further illustrates that we can't ignore this aspect of the group, even if, the violent parts of it are the ones that get the news. And we've seen, what's happening in Mali, Nigeria, and Somalia, and Mozambique. It's not at the level of sophistication of the governance efforts that we saw in Iraq and Syria, let alone in Libya. But we do see sort of these proto-governance aspects as well as some level of social services, sort of similar to what we might have seen in Syria in, say, 2013 when they're really first building themselves up. And the thing is they have the space to potentially do that in these locales, considering the fact that the pressure upon them is different now than it was maybe post 2014 after the coalition was created to go against the Islamic State. And part of that has to do, especially when we're looking at the Sahel region, because of the different coups that have happened there, and then Russia becoming the partner of these different countries and therefore creating other issues. I'll get to that in a little bit more deeply. But one of the things I think is important to highlight also on top of, sort of these emergent governance projects within different parts of Africa is the fact that they still have continued shadow governance in Eastern Syria, even if they don't control territory. And I think, the case of what we saw with the Taliban in Afghanistan before they took over Afghanistan, it's not something you can ignore. Obviously, militarily, they took over the country quickly, but once they did, they're able to start the governance of Afghanistan relatively quickly too. So having that continued experience, as well as institutional knowledge, provides, the opportunity, if the U.S. did leave, for them to quickly, I think, take over different parts of Deir ez-Zor province. And while, the shadow governance that they're doing isn't as sophisticated as it was previously when they did control territory there, it highlights that they do still have this sort of skeletal aspect of it, and that they can build it out if they needed to, if the opportunity was there. And, as I shown some of the administrative documents on the bottom, they're still putting out administrative documents. The one on the middle, I guess you could say, is related to, women and the niqab. And so, moral policing related to this is still going on vis-a-vis gender issues, whether it is what women are wearing, whether it is about boys and girls in classrooms together, whether it is related to the curriculum that the Kurds are trying to implement into different regions which are more conservative and tribalistic, as well as taxation, or you can say extortion, which is probably more like it. And then, one of the things, if you look at local sources, is that while it is true that the SDF controls the territory, quote unquote, it's primarily during the daytime. So at night, a lot of the times ISIS will go in and kind of do its own thing. So it's not like they completely control everything. So again, I would foresee, if there was the opportunity and the US did leave, that the Islamic State would be able to take advantage relatively quickly. Just to briefly talk about some of the stuff in our own, home countries for those living in Western countries. This is just some of the data from the map that Lydia was talking about at the beginning during the introduction. This is some of the data from the last couple of years related to arrests. Thankfully, there hasn't been too much stuff happening in Australia, but as you can see, there still have been a number of arrests related to the Islamic State in the United States, as well as Western Europe, over the last, 2, 3, 5 years. And therefore, even if they haven't been able to actualize any large scale attacks, there have, of course, been some small attacks here and there, stabbings, car rammings, things like that. There are still people that are eager and interested in doing something on behalf of the Islamic State. I think sometimes we get a false sense of the state of the group, or what people are interested in related to the group, by only looking at successful attacks. But if you look at the whole body of it, it shows that there are still people very much interested in this group, even if from our perspective or perception, the Islamic State isn't strong anymore. But from their perception, the Islamic State is still on the march. And that's why they're doing stuff on the group's behalf. One of the things also to note that I think is interesting, this presentation is primarily about the Islamic State, but I think one of the key reasons why the Islamic State has been able to survive and be adaptable and sustainable over the last 5 years, considering the fact that they have had a turnover of 4 leaders now since the fall of IS controlling territory, is that they have more of a legalistic model of who's in charge versus a charismatic model. I think that really hurt Al-Qaeda in many ways. After bin Laden died, we obviously saw a big difference with Zawahiri. You could also possibly attribute to the fact that, the Islamic State did leave Al-Qaeda as a consequence of Zawahiri not being bin Laden, as well as HTS for that matter, if we're going outside of the context of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So it's something to note, especially considering, the current, questions about the leadership within Al-Qaeda Central now post, Ayman al-Zawahiri being killed, and them not admitting it still, and Saif al-Adil being in charge now allegedly, but it's in Iran, and therefore that creates ideological issues. But all of the people under him are primarily in other areas outside of their traditional locations in the AfPak region, and thus, there are questions about the future of sort of the senior leadership within Al-Qaeda, whereas the Islamic State is like, they keep calm and carry on. Our leader's dead. Okay, next guy up. It doesn't matter. I mean, none of us even know who the current caliph is now. I mean, we have his kunya, but like who he actually is, and it doesn't even matter, because every single time there's been a leader killed, you'll see the Bayat campaign from ISIS, and all the people with their guns, as the picture shows, are up, celebrating the new caliph, blah, blah, blah. And as we've seen, the Islamic State has been able to continue its, insurgencies, terrorism campaigns, governance projects, external operations, financing, and it really hasn't been hindered at all by the fact So I think it's important when we're considering the future of the Islamic State also, is that, this leadership model in some ways is more sustainable, unless somebody that comes into power is maybe a bit more narcissistic and egotistical and kind of changes that, and therefore makes it more difficult. But thus far, with the leadership changes that have happened with sort of the first four quote unquote caliphs, they've continued with this model. Just to wrap it up, because I know I've been talking for about 35 minutes or so. Some conclusions, future trajectories, things to think about before the Q&A. I would argue in some ways that even though the Islamic State looks different now than it did 5 years ago when it lost territory in Iraq and Syria, in some ways it's more integrated now organizationally when it was before. Previously, the Iraq and Syria provinces were kind of out on their own island, and the external provinces were kind of doing their own things, whereas now they changed sort of the organizational structure in the last 5 years, where they're all kind of on the same par together and they've coordinated more. Obviously, we know historically on the media front, they've always had it extremely centralized. But when you're looking at the governance projects, it very much is following the same model that we saw with IS in Iraq, Syria, and Libya when they were in control of territory there. The financing is being run through their Somalia province, and it's being sent to various provinces in Africa. It's being sent to ISKP. For example, the ISKP attack on the US soldiers when the US was leaving was planned and financed by IS Somalia, off to the Turkish province as well as into Syria. So you can see that there's a lot more connection. And then just like in the past where they were calling for foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria, we've seen them trying to do that in other locales too. While it obviously hasn't been successful in the same way, some of it has to do with structural factors and the fact that it's a lot easier to get to Syria in some ways to some of these other locales like Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, Mozambique, or Afghanistan for that matter. It's still happening. We're seeing more signs that there is an interest beyond just countries surrounding these insurgencies, where we've seen some interest from other regions of people trying to go there. It's still relatively small, but something to think about. And then in terms of external operations, where they've been able to spread this out beyond just Syria, where historically they had been doing the external operations from, now it's via ISKP. I would suspect that there's some, things happening with the other provinces that assist with some of these as well, considering the fact that ISKP doesn't control territory. And then I would say that I think power competition is undermining counterterrorism. There isn't the same level of trust. If you look at the cases of the ISKP attacks in Iran and Russia, the US warned both of them. They ignored them. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they don't trust each other anymore, or for whatever reason, they didn't want to listen to the United States. And I suspect that we'll see similar things going forward. Then, I think people weren't looking at it through this vantage point at the time, but in many ways, Syria is, a prime case of this, whereby, if Russia hadn't gone into Syria to assist the Assad regime, it's plausible that the Islamic State, as well as other, terrorist groups, wouldn't still be conducting their capabilities there, because the US has been able to degrade them alongside its allies so much. But because the US can't go into the areas where the Assad regime is operating in Russia, it's, an incomplete CT mission. Then, as I noted in the Sahel, obviously the Russians have different rules of engagement than the French did when fighting ISIS, or Jnim for that matter, the Al-Qaeda branch there, which led to a lot of massacres. Either people have gone north to become IDPs or refugees, or people have joined the groups to seek revenge. And therefore, we've seen that they've continued to spread amongst Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, with attacks into places like Benin and Togo now. And then in Afghanistan, while it is true that the Taliban has been fighting ISKP, because of the fact that the Taliban's in power, it makes it more difficult for, say, if the US wanted to maybe drone strike somebody that's in ISKP there, especially considering the fact that they've developed relatively close relationships with China now, as well as other US adversaries like Iran and Russia. Of course, the Taliban's gotten very close with US allies too, such as Qatar and Turkey. But because of that, because the Taliban does have some pretty good backing now by China, it makes it more difficult when we're thinking about maneuvering if there was sort of like a, imminent threat possibly. And then related to Mozambique, it's primarily due to the fact that there's one of the bigger, natural gas projects going on there that's run by a French company that they haven't been able to put online because of IS's, campaign there. And as a consequence, that's, from the perspective of people thinking about, the Ukraine war, people want more energy in the markets just because of inflation and all the prices going up, even if we do probably want in the longer term more sustainable energy sources than natural gas. And then the thing too, when you're thinking about the Ukraine war in general, Russia has gone all in there. So all of their security and intelligence is primarily focused on Ukraine. And as we've seen now in the last few months, first with the Crocus attack, then a few weeks ago with the prison riot / break attempt, and then just the other day where they're going against police officers as well as burning churches and synagogues, it's clear that some of their CT capacities domestically have hindered as a consequence of this. Then finally, just to note that I think that there will be a long tail related to 10/7 attacks and Israel's response related to it. There have been 42 terrorist plots / attacks across the globe that are directly related to the 10/7 attacks. Most of the targets are against Jews and Israelis, but we've also seen a few against Muslims, as well as some related to the United States, just because the U.S. obviously has been supporting them. But and most of them have been sort of single actor type of plots and attacks. But we have seen 4 related to ISIS. And then when you get outside of sort of the global context, internal to Israel, there have been 11 IS-related arrests within Israel since 10/7, which most people don't realize, just because most of the focus is, of course, on Hamas. But ISIS has been trying to take advantage of this. So I think that's pretty much, just a quick plug for the map, just because it is a good way of keeping up with everything online in relation to it. And, we update it in near time. As you could see, I took a screenshot before I, did this. So you could see that last updated today, or I guess that's actually, the date is June 25th. So it's today in the US because it's based off of the US time. But you get what I mean. So, we update it every day with the most, contemporaneous data, but also we continue to also backfill data as well, historically, so that there's, more context as well. So I'll just leave it at that. I know that we have about 20 minutes to talk now. For those outside of the room, here's some contact details as well as all my various projects and websites if you're interested in anything. But for those in the room, I also have business cards if you want to be in touch ever in the future. So thank you again, Lydia, for having me.
Thank you, Aaron. That was terrific. It's such a really great comprehensive presentation on Islamic State globally, which we actually don't quite get to hear much of lately, considering, it seems like it's been overtaken by a lot of things. But as your presentation shows, still a very active movement, one that we need to keep track of and engaged with. So I'll just remind our folks online, if you have a question for Aaron, just please put it in the Q&A function. And for those in the room, just feel free to raise your hand, ask a question of Aaron. I might have one to kind of kick us off. I was struck by a comment that you said around their Islamic State remaining very much a governance project, that they keep trying to do that over and over again. And I'm wondering if the Islamic State is focused primarily on governance, right? How much does that matter from a CT perspective? So if they take over some territory in Africa, they govern that territory, maybe we don't like how they govern it, it's not according to what we do. Does that really matter from a global CT perspective, or even from the CT perspective of the Five Eyes?
I mean, I think, one of the biggest consequences of it is that it could lead to, more terrorism in general within these regions, because they continue, this isn't a group that's just interested in a specific country, national project. If we're thinking of other Islamist groups involved in governance projects, whether it's, the Taliban or Hamas or Hezbollah, they're focused on Afghanistan, Lebanon, Palestine, what have you. Whereas Islamic State, they're going to want to continue to grow and grow and grow. And therefore, it's going to create more and more destabilization in more and more countries. And therefore, from a security perspective, obviously, nobody wants that. And then also, as we've seen in the past, when they've had sort of, stable environment to govern, it's also allowed more people to potentially become foreign fighters, and therefore they could potentially then return home and be involved in terrorism attacks. Or because they have a stable environment, they can put resources into trying to guide people online to do attacks abroad also. So, even if they do control territory there still are potential ramifications of it from a security perspective, locally, regionally, as well as globally.
So can I tease a little bit about that a little further? So you said, okay, well, there are Islamist governance projects like Hezbollah, Hamas, like you said. And sometimes in the broader media frame, there's a lot of comparison between like a Hezbollah or Hamas and Islamic State, saying, they want to govern the same way. They're essentially the same thing.
No.
Can you break that down for us a little?
Well, I mean, I think there's a big difference between them. I mean, for one, both Hamas and Hezbollah hate ISIS, and ISIS hates Hezbollah and Hamas, just just plainly speaking. But when you drill it down, I mean, Hamas, its ideological background mainly comes from the Muslim Brotherhood, which views it as more of a social movement and gradualist approach to governance, working within society. They're okay with the international system. They were involved in elections within Palestine. At least that's how they first got into some level of power almost 20 years ago now in Gaza, at least. Obviously they were then involved in a coup against Fatah, but that's a whole other issue. But from an ideological perspective, ISIS would never be involved in democracy or elections. They view that as another religion, because you're essentially equating humans legislating to God, which is the only one that's allowed to legislate. And the fact is that Hamas only focuses on Palestine. They're not interested in a worldwide caliphate, which is what the Islamic State wants, because they think everybody should be under, this umbrella of their Ummah, essentially, or Islamic nation. Then from Hezbollah's perspective, of course, they're Shiite, which, the Islamic State views as not real Muslims. They're rejectionists from their perspective, ideologically speaking, because they're not Sunnis. And then, of course, their ideological, background is more related to Iran and Ayatollah Khomeini, going back to, all of his ideas related to Vilayat al-Faqih, and sort of government by clerics, more or less. And also, even though there are those connections to Iran, of course, Hezbollah's primary focus, is on Lebanon, and they're not trying to, themselves control any other territory, even if they ally themselves with other groups that are similar in other countries. It's more an alliance in some ways, in the same way that, countries in Europe are allied with one another, even if they have similar worldviews, I guess you could say. And then the thing too is that sort of the ideological background, I guess, or at least the theological aspects of the Islamic State comes from Salafism, and they have a certain then methodology of how to implement it. And that's one of the disagreements that they have with a group like Al-Qaeda, where they believe that they have the wrong methodology in terms of implementation, as well as the fact that, the Islamic State views anybody that essentially disagrees with its worldview as not a real Muslim or an infidel, and therefore they must be fought. Whereas Al-Qaeda is slightly more lenient, maybe not that much, but definitely more than.
All relative.
Yeah, I mean, Al-Qaeda essentially is like, okay, we'll tell you these ideas. You have the opportunity to join us. If you disagree with it, then we'll probably fight with you. Whereas the Islamic State is like, you don't agree with us off the bat, we'll kill you now. Mm-hmm. So at least Al-Qaeda gives you the opportunity to potentially join them.
Did you have a question? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm just wondering about Hizb ut-Tahrir. How do you see that, having been prescribed in the UK as a terrorist organization? How do you see that kind of group? What are their aspirations and how do they fit?
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of have their own separate ideological background that is distinguished from sort of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is sort of a bottom-up approach. And then obviously a group like the Islamic State, which is involved in actual violence on a day-to-day basis. Hizb ut-Tahrir, they want to have a caliphate too, but they see it as a vanguard of people taking over a state via coup d'etat. And that's pretty much it. Obviously, they've been trying to allegedly accomplish that for 70 plus years now. I'm not quite sure how successful that will actually be, since it's a lot easier said than done to have a coup. But yeah, they're just another group that's, trying to spread their, ideas related to the importance of Islam in society, as well as the necessity of the caliphate. But, Hizb ut-Tahrir would not back the Islamic State because of the way that it operates. And then the Islamic State views Hizb ut-Tahrir as a bunch of losers. They're just like essentially talking the talk, but not walking the walk, and just like talking all day and not really doing much of anything, or like an intellectual movement than anything, and not, actually practically doing anything to get to this point.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, if I may. I was interested in your discussion about the change in governance structure. Do you think that they've become more resilient and more adaptive in recent years?
I think that's definitely true because they've been able to sort of have the whole organization on par with each other, where there was sort of a hierarchy before where the branches or provinces in Iraq and Syria were kind of seen as above all the other provinces in different parts of the world where they're operating, just because that's where the group originally started. But then there's more parity between all of them since they lost control of territory in Iraq and Syria, and that's why we've seen them be able to continue to sustain itself as well as rebuild itself in many different areas. And one of the interesting things that's come out recently is there are reports that the US killed the leader of IS in Somalia, and the way that they framed it, I didn't completely agree with, but based off of my sort of interpretation of what happened, he is the individual Abdul Qadir movement essentially became the head of the General Directorate of Provinces, which is essentially the body within the Islamic State that manages everything going on. The Caliphate isn't micromanaging things, of course. So even if this guy in Somalia is not the caliph, he still had an extremely important position with the organization. And also the fact that, if you look at the history of senior leadership within the Islamic State, the vast majority of them were Iraqis. Then you had some Syrians. There was some exceptions here and there, with the military commander being Chechen and then a Tajik, but for the most part, they've been Iraqis and Syrians. So the fact that they could have shifted the role of sort of managing the global network to somebody that's Somali, I think is very symbolic to showing that they have adapted in some ways, especially since the Somalia provinces have been a key node in its financial networks since 2019 when they lost territory. So you could see that they've been able to, maybe assign different roles to different provinces within the global network itself, so that it's not just focused in a core in the same way that maybe Al-Qaeda did in the AFPAC, which really hurt them because so many of the institutional knowledge within Al-Qaeda was there, and obviously many of the leaders were killed.
I just wanted to follow up on Lydia's question, actually, on the establishment of IS overseas and what that means for threat context, say in Australia or other privatized countries. So what you said was that letting them establish themselves will obviously have ramifications here in terms of a threat context. But I think thinking back, one of the key changes in Australia was when there was a call from IS saying, "Don't come here, do attacks at home."
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, to what extent they're gonna do these kind of directives to people, put that out again.
I mean, they have put that out still. They've also once again called for people to be foreign fighters, just primarily in their African provinces. But like I said, it's a lot easier said than done, considering where you'd have to go to get to these places, because they're pretty rural areas and countries that are not necessarily the easiest to get to, especially if you don't have a ton of money to get there.
Yeah.
Whereas Syria is much easier because you just got to go through Turkey, and Turkey obviously is connected to everywhere in the world through Turkish Airlines.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you look at the map from before about stuff in the West, obviously there hasn't been a ton of stuff in Australia or New Zealand. I don't know if you guys have some kind of exceptionalism or you guys have some solution to something, but it's clearly still an issue in the US, Canada, and Western Europe. So people in those countries or that continent, it still resonates with them, maybe in a way that for whatever reason it doesn't resonate as much here, maybe because Australia and New Zealand's so far away. And also, I mean, it's also plausible that maybe because IS in this part of the world isn't as big of a problem, like obviously for a minute there was them controlling territory in the Philippines, but like that more or less is not a thing anymore. You know, there have been some attacks in Maldives. There's the one big one in Sri Lanka. You know, one of the interesting things is that we really haven't seen ISKP trying to target this way. It's all been to the west and north of them, and not sort of, I guess, south, quote unquote. Maybe it's because they don't have access to, you know, networks in the same way here of people, or plugging into people that might be interested in it. But it is interesting if you kind of look at the data between Australia and New Zealand compared to US, Canada, and all the Western European countries, where clearly it's still an issue. I mean, you're seeing arrests every week in those areas, more or less. I mean, especially in Europe, less so in the US. The US is just so big.
Can I ask a follow-up about and I'll go back to you, Mama. Just a question about the stats for this.
Yeah.
So when you say homegrown arrests in the West, are those that have very specifically called or related to the Islamic
Yes.
State, or inspired by kind of jihadist ideology?
No, this is just Islamic State.
Yeah, perhaps maybe that's the difference in Australia, that there have been some concerns around being inspired by jihadist ideology and violence generally,
Yeah.
but maybe not that. But Mo, please.
Oh, no, well, I was just gonna ask if you know anything about Indonesia? Because I feel like there's Philippines and then there's Indonesia,
Sure.
and that's
I
a
mean,
lot
there
closer to home.
have been
Australia.
like arrests here and there, and there have obviously been some small attacks here and there, but it's, you know, not, it doesn't seem like it's a huge problem. I mean, not on the level that we see in other places of the world, for sure. You know, there's actually been like 3 arrests in Malaysia in the last week or 2 weeks, which has been interesting, just because Malaysia is usually relatively quiet too. I don't know if it's just a specific network of people and therefore they got intelligence and found other people or what, but I guess it's something to, you know, think about if it becomes a trend. But obviously 2 weeks of data is not really a trend. It's kind of a small sample size. But it is interesting when you sort of see clusters like that out of nowhere and what that might mean. But yeah, I mean, yeah, Southeast Asia kind of just like, it's just not as an immediate threat in the same way it was, I guess, 5 years or so ago or more, when things were really popping off in the Philippines. So,
Thank you.
yeah, no worries.
Well, we're about closing time, unless there's one last question from anyone there. All right, well, thanks, Aaron, for that terrific presentation, engaging with our questions and with our network. So please join me in thanking Dr. Aaron Zelin, and we'll see you for the next Avert webinar. Thanks.